Welcome back, everyone, to Unclassified 14, maybe? We took a 2-week break because I was off in Europe, and then I hung out with Preston in Abu Dhabi. So we were all over the world, and what a terrible 2 weeks to miss, because, oh my God, it just, did the country collapse? Preston, though, how you doing?
Good, man. It was a weird stretch there, I will say. Lesson learned. We thought we were going to be able to record while you were in Brussels. That didn't pan out. Just a mix of scheduling, really. And then we thought, well, we'll be together in Abu Dhabi for like a whole week. Certainly we can record there. And the same thing, like a mix of the equipment, the timing, the ability to upload. So I would say lesson learned, but more like the lesson learned is that we couldn't do it. I don't know exactly what the fix is. We'll try to get there. But yeah, dude, my big takeaway from that trip together was I'm running around IDEX, this massive military conference, in over my head, just trying to keep up with what's happening. Because we were essentially like a 12-hour time difference. So when we would wake up in the morning, it was about 12 hours different here in the United States. So we would wake up to seeing the day's news. And then Ben and I would get started, like recording a ton of content throughout IDEX. And then we'd wrap up the day as people were waking up here in the U.S. So our schedules were all messed up, but I was like completely out of the loop on most things. Ben here, however, apparently is just a voracious consumer of information left and right, and I had no idea. We'd be walking through the trade show, and Ben would be like, "Hey, man, listen, did you see the recent polls out of the German election?" Like,
Yeah.
no.
I get these wire notifications mixed with the Apple Watch. So I'm always tapped in, dude. I'm always tapped in. And
wild.
is it healthy? Probably not. But it keeps me in the loop. But being,
So
like you said, the information gap there, it's interesting to experience the news backwards. Because usually here in America, you wake up and you're just trying to keep up with the American news, and then, you kind of forget the European news. But you're seeing the European news before you see the American news. And by the time you go to bed, 400 things have happened when it's time to go to bed in Abu Dhabi. So, crazy.
Well, I want to ask you a lot about. You were quite the time to be at NATO headquarters, Ben. So I want to ask you a lot about that.
Yeah.
I got sick coming back from Abu Dhabi, and my daughter's in the next room because, as she likes to say, I gave her my sickness. So I've got cough drops. I've got water. We'll make it through this because there's too much, and I'm interested in having this conversation. But Ben, you're at NATO headquarters. This was the defense ministerial, I think is the way it's referred to. So defense ministers, secretaries of defense from around the world, and you're there as two big things happen. The Munich Security Conference went off, where Vice President Vance kind of just chastised Europe over free speech and democracy. Didn't really talk about that little thing going on in Ukraine right now, which is essentially what the Munich Security Conference was focused around. So that drew a lot of attention. And in the same couple days there, you had Secretary Hegseth at NATO saying that NATO membership is off the table for Ukraine and essentially ceding a fair amount of territory to Russia for any future peace talks. What was the atmosphere like as those bombs dropped on the international community?
So when I first arrived, before, pandemonium broke out, the attitude was good, People were cautiously optimistic, a lot of we'll wait and see. I remember the first night, we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see. Well, we wait and saw, and the next day, Pete Hegseth's out there talking about making unilateral decisions about Ukraine, saying they won't be into NATO, and they're going to have to give up territory. And then later on that night, Trump comes out and he says that, Ukraine's responsible for the war, that they're not going to get NATO, they have to give up land. I don't think at this point he had called him a dictator yet, Zelensky, that is. But so all that's happening, and so the attitude, I'd say, for the rest of the trip was one of, what the hell, right? Like, just total, distraught, a lot of anger, I think. Also, just a lot
Dial into
of
that.
people.
Dial it in
Go ahead.
real quick. Dial into that anger. I want to hear about that. Was it? You don't have to share names if you don't want, but maybe countries. Where was the anger coming from? Who is it directed at? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there's a lot of anger in the sense that, like, the United States and Europe have been working together as equal partners, right? The United States, I guess, is the senior partner in that relationship, but a lot of it is, the United States takes... Europe has their defense industries, right? And the United States has kind of dismantled them to a certain extent and then forces them to buy American arms. And this is entirely, their arms industry still exists, but you know what I'm getting at here. Everyone listening knows what I'm getting at here. And then they have the nerve to turn around and chastise them over defense spending, whatever. But the idea here is, like, basically they signal this total betrayal of Ukraine, total betrayal of NATO, as they talk about withdrawing troops, as he did, Pete Hegseth did. People are just furious, right? And this just, people expected, I think, a betrayal for Trump, but they didn't expect it to happen unilaterally via his defense secretary. And then he came out and he made the situation even worse. People are mad. They're mad at America. They're mad at Trump. They're mad at Pete Hegseth. What are we doing? We're just blowing up the Western alliance for what reason exactly? And at this point, it had not become clear that the United States was taking the side of Russia in the war yet. That happened last week. This Ukraine stuff happens 2 weeks ago, right? So, the mood, my understanding is, in talking to other creators, talking to officials, both at the State Department and NATO and other delegations and missions around the world, is people are very upset as of right now. Because what is the United States of America doing right now? Other than appearing to join the Axis powers. I don't know.
It felt like, something we talked about during the appointment process was Secretary Hegseth, and one of my concerns was we really haven't heard much from him on geopolitical issues and, like, how are we going to counter adversaries. He spent a lot of his time and energy on what I viewed as, like, personnel issues within the force, readiness issues, which is a thing and should not be brushed aside like it's nothing. But he gave a press conference at NATO, and to me it felt like he was a little out over his skis. Again, like these aren't topics he spent a lot of time maybe studying, or maybe he just can't articulate it well. I don't know. But I watched him get pressed by a couple European-based reporters that have been covering NATO and, like, focused on NATO for 10, 15, 20 years, something like that. And they kind of walked circles, made him, kind of trip and stumble. And it's interesting in certain interviews, you can see when somebody has more knowledge on a subject than the other, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And they were asking him questions, and he was kind of veering in different directions. They were like, no, that is not what, no, come back to this. So I can see the frustration and the concern and probably the confusion from Europe at this point, because those statements, while they could, I have a hard time understanding why those weren't really hammered out behind closed doors. Because, again, the whole purpose of an alliance is you want to present a strong face to the enemy. In this case, NATO, generally we're speaking about facing off against Russia. So coming out and saying something like this, it showed cracks in the armor. There were supposed to be cracks in the armor. People thought there might be cracks in the armor. But looking across some Russian Telegram channels, they loved this. They've actually been on a celebration streak for about 2 weeks now, because they see, from my perspective, it looks like what they're seeing is the United States is not going to support NATO in the way that maybe people thought, that we're not as staunch an ally in that organization as people thought. So the way that some Russians are interpreting that is a war with NATO might actually not be a war with the United States. And you can think from their perspective, that changes everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. It does. I would argue that Russia still would have a hard time against NATO, but even without the United States in it. But yeah, it does change everything. And now, they had these peace talks with Russia without Ukraine and Saudi Arabia, where they discussed withdrawing U.S. troops from all of Europe entirely, which is effectively, given the language coming out of the administration, that it's just the alliance is over. if the troops leave the continent. And they keep saying we need to focus on China, we need to focus on the southern border. That's what Pete Hegseth told the Ukrainians in Brussels. He said we need to focus on the southern border. But there are 1.1 million U.S. active duty troops. Only 100,000 of them are based in Europe, and only another 60,000 are based overseas. There are so many more troops to go around. I don't understand this. We need to focus on China because we need NATO in order to counteract China. We need their economic might. We need their forces. We need their industry. So it seems like we are, like I said, I mean, Pete Hegseth, the TV show host, it seems like we are TV show hosting our way into total hegemonic collapse.
So I had somebody push back with what I think was a genuine assessment. I just, in response, think it could have been done differently, where he said, hey, not the response, but the U.S. action could have been differently. He said, hey, I think the way that the reason this was happening is the U.S. saying, Europe, take care of NATO, take care of Ukraine, take care of Russia. We, the United States, are going to take point on China. And I don't think that's crazy far off. We realistically should not expect the degree of NATO and European support in a conflict with China as we would in a conflict with Russia. And that's not a knock on the Europeans. It's just a geographic thing. We have a lot of allies in the Asia-Pacific region that we would lean on heavily there that we are not necessarily leaning on when it comes to any possible conflict with Russia. So to me, it seems like that could have been a nice behind-the-scenes conversation of like, hey, guys, listen. We have to pivot over here. We've been talking about it for a long time, and we haven't really done it. So we're going to, and we're going to prioritize China, just like we're saying we're going to, but we are not going to abandon you. We just need you to step up because, like, to be blunt, we're stepping back a little bit. And I feel like that wouldn't have been a crazy conversation to have behind closed doors. Maybe it did, and it never got anywhere, but given how early this is in the administration, it makes me think that those conversations weren't really hammered out, and this was more just a, hey, this is what we're doing. Now, in terms of the reallocation of troops, we have actually seen a fair number of troops already redeployed to the southern border, active duty military personnel, which it's pretty quick, all things considered. They took some from Fort Drum up in New York. So these poor boys and girls up in Watertown, New York, freezing their ass off in the middle of February, get to go down to Texas for the winter. So that's the only bright side. I have a feeling that most active duty troops are not going to be very excited about a deployment to Texas or Arizona. Nothing to do with policy, everything to do with essentially they're deployed, but they're in the United States and like not a war zone, and just kind of some weird dynamics there. But anyways, we have not yet seen, from my perspective, any sort of large pivot to China or to the Pacific. Now, to be fair, that would take longer than just moving dudes from Oklahoma to Texas on the border mission. But I think it's something we have to keep an eye on because we're kind of talking that big game. And I think that's an argument that I am open to. I'm open to all arguments, but this is one that I'm very interested in, is that the people that are, and there's some people moving into the Defense Department right now that are saying Russia is nothing. It's an important issue for Europe, but for us, the United States, we have to be focused on China. And I understand that argument, but we haven't taken action to back it up. So it'll be very interesting to see if we actually end up doing that, or is that pivot to China more of just an excuse to kind of withdraw from Europe? And I think that has yet to be seen.
I mean, for one, if that was the case, I don't see how taking Russia's side, in the war.
Okay, we hadn't gotten to that point. That's fair.
Right. So, I mean, I don't know how that works, but I think my understanding is in the 2022 strategic review, the Biden administration dropped, which, granted, that is the Biden administration, but typically these things last long term because they're not necessarily done by the president. I mean, the president has some say in them, but they're mostly done by civilian executive branch staff, right, who have worked here their whole lives. And they say that the United States should not necessarily be the leader, but maybe take a step back a little bit and therefore lead a global coalition. And they kind of mend this idea of combining NATO with our Pacific allies, right? And the United States kind of being somewhat of the leader of this, but more so being the connection. And that is how they combat China. So NATO, to a certain extent, does have a key part in that. I mean, maybe. I am 27 years old, and since I was in high school, I've been hearing about this pivot to China. It's been over 10 years. I will believe it when I see it.
Almost elusive as the old Cubs World Series, right? Isn't that what they would say?
It is. Well, we did win.
Got there, yeah.
Wow, you're right.
Have
It's
I
a
told
little
you-
older than the Cubs World Series, yeah.
We're going to pivot to that story real quick, go off subject. So I'm from Illinois originally. Ben's in Illinois now. I used to work for a company in Chicago, and we had a sales meeting there over during the World Series. And it was whatever game the Cubs won. So I don't know if it was Game 6, Game 7. Not a big baseball guy, but they won. But it wasn't in Chicago, I don't believe. I think it was away, but Wrigleyville was just packed. So all the Cubs fans went down to Wrigleyville. One of our sales reps was a huge Cubs fan from Cincinnati. He came to the sales meeting decked out in Cubs gear because he came in the day prior wearing all of his Cubs gear, so excited for the World Series, forgot to pack any business attire. So all he had were like Cubs sweatshirts and jeans. He was just so amped to be in Chicago for the World Series. Dude goes to Wrigleyville. It's one of those situations where, like, to get an Uber out of Wrigleyville at 2 o'clock in the morning is like $340 or something crazy. So the dude has to walk like 5 miles through Chicago to try to get to a spot where, gets back to the hotel at like 4 in the morning, comes to work at 7 in just clothes that are covered in beer, reek of cigarettes. The dude is, not really hungover because he's still drunk. It was great. Felt really happy for Justin on that event. Yeah, good company that they let that go on. They just laughed at him.
Right. Yeah. No, that day probably the greatest day of my life. One of them. I mean, gosh, and the ending 8, 7, and 10. God, unbelievable. Anyways.
All right. Yeah. Let me get back. Yeah. So you've said a couple times now, and I think this is God. Ben, this is happening. There's so many things happening so fast. That I start to form an opinion or a thought about how something is happening, and then it changes. Somebody says something different, it changes. So you a couple times in this conversation already have said the United States is taking Russia's side. Now, that is a pretty aggressive statement. I would like you to expand on where you're getting that from.
Yeah, so, you have Trump saying that Ukraine started the war, right? And then you have his administrations come out here. Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, two men that know better, who have said otherwise, have said the reverse in statements, and are now saying, well, I agree with President Trump, whatever. I mean, he's your boss, but whatever. They're saying that. You get into, these UN statements. There's supposed to be a UN resolution at today. It'd be supposed to be passed. That the United States is opposing because it condemns Russia and it supports the territorial integrity of Ukraine. They're also blocking a G7 communique that condemns Russia for the invasion and supports Ukraine's territorial integrity. It is also the 3-year anniversary of this war. And as far as I know, the White House has not released any statement on it. Granted, it's only 8:43 a.m., but that's the kind of thing you have queued up, right? So all of that, on top of the fact that we are trying to shake down Ukraine in this mineral deal and negotiating a peace deal without Ukraine being there and President Trump saying they have no right to be there. So that is where I'm coming from there. I don't think it's exaggeration to say that the United States now is more friendly with Russia than it is, Europe, Canada, Mexico. Good God. What is going on here with this policy? What are your thoughts?
It does seem to me like something changed rapidly and without explanation, which is frustrating. We can change opinions, and I welcome it. I think that's a good thing. But for something big like this, you would expect some sort of explanation to that. I haven't seen that, specifically from Rubio and Waltz. General Kellogg, to me, at this point, seems to be pretty consistent, but also relatively sidelined. He's not being brought in nearly as much as I had hoped. And randomly, I have a kind of odd connection there. So
No, you're good.
General Kellogg's. No, I mean to General Kellogg. I have a weird connection to General Kellogg.
I thought you meant the recording. Sorry.
Yeah. So his daughter Megan runs an organization that's in Ukraine. She was a West Point grad, 2008. So we were there at the same time. I was 2009, so she graduated a year ahead, and she married a guy named Mike, who was my first sergeant during basic training at West Point, who was I think a year before. So I had no idea that was the relationship there, but kind of pieced all of that together in the last. I'm probably the last one to piece that together in the last week or so. But either way, it does seem like Kellogg is being somewhat sidelined. I've enjoyed when he's come out on the news a couple times because he's been pushing back against some of these like ridiculous statements where he's just like, yeah, guys, listen, that's not true, and lays out bare what's going on. Rubio and Waltz, however, is concerning because we're seeing a flip on this issue without explanation, and it feels very conciliatory to Russia and very aggressive, even demeaning in a sense, towards our allies. That is a big turn. So the best I can make of this is that is that maybe we view that we're so far in this anti-Russia camp that to be considered any sort of neutral arbiter for a ceasefire, we need to veer heavy off in the other direction. I think that's a misread in a lot of ways. Yeah. I don't think you need to abdicate Russia of their responsibility for starting a war in order to negotiate some sort of ceasefire. It's interesting, again, because it feels to me like mixed signals. We're talking about peace through strength is one of the key components that we're hearing from Hegseth and from Trump recently, and Rubio. Peace through strength. I don't think that strength is going to Russia and saying, you guys, you had no choice here. We get you.
Right.
Don't worry. You don't have to concede anything. That doesn't feel like strength. That feels like weakness. And I don't think we need to take it to the extreme of like make the Russian state cripple the Russian state for eternity either. Like, I think you can get closer to a neutral arbiter without, to your point, siding with Russia on way too many of these things that, like, the idea that, like, and this drove me up the wall when Trump was going off on Zelensky the other day, and he rattled off a bunch of, you can't even call them Russian talking points because Russian media was like, where the hell did he get that from? Like, it was so, some of the stuff was like, saying that Zelensky has a 4% approval rating. Even the Russians were like, I don't know where that number came from. That's wild.
He has a higher approval rating than Trump.
Yeah. Like, so it seems like we do this in politics, right? We veer hard in one direction and then overcorrect to try to get back in the middle. It feels a little bit like that, but I don't think it's the right move. And I don't think we're seeing the correct path taken right now.
Yeah, and I would say, like, this is not normal in terms of American history. Throughout, like, all of time, American foreign policy has been pretty much the same regardless of president. Like, it differs in key spots, right? But it was not until Trump's first term that things got really kooky there, where he started changing things. And now it seems like we're doing a full, hard pivot. But, yeah, they're doing this thing where they're trying to accommodate Russia and they're backing under the pressure of the Cold War. But, I mean, they're just appeasing them, and I don't quite get why. And people say they're doing it for negotiations. Nah. And look, the United States doesn't need to be a neutral arbiter. I don't even know why we're trying to negotiate a ceasefire in the first place. We should continue to enable the Ukrainians. And if they say we need a ceasefire, then we can negotiate one. But to me, it just seems like we're throwing it all away for no particular reason. And I know Macron is in America today. He's at the White House right now, having a come-to-Jesus moment with him. And he says that him and Trump respect each other in a very unique way, which is his exact words, whatever that means. And he says that he's going to tell him not to take Putin's side. We'll see what happens. I don't know if they'll have a joint press conference, but Trump did not come out to meet Macron when he arrived. And then after Macron leaves, Starmer arrives on Thursday to talk to Trump. And so we will see what happens there. But I am not optimistic. And I think the new German elections, I think that says a lot. I think the new results of the German election say a lot, and I think it will be the new way forward throughout the West.
Okay, I want to ask you some questions about that German election, but I do want to bring up one thing. There was some pushback. I think gaslighting might be the term here. I always mix up these terms, and I hate to overuse that, but I did see a lot of people saying that there was pushback because Trump is going to talk to the Russians, or we are talking to the Russians. I think there probably was some. I don't think that's a problem at all. I have been in the camp that like we should have communications open at all times. I view any sort of like shutting them off diplomatically as essentially being a temper tantrum. It's like a little bit of a punishment that maybe isn't even actually a punishment and probably just puts us all at greater risk of a misunderstanding. So talking with the Russians, fine. No issue at all. I think that's probably a good move. And looking back, I wish the Biden administration would have had more contact directly with the Russians. I don't know that would have fixed or resolved anything. I just don't know that not talking is like, what did it actually, this is a good way to look at it. What did that accomplish? Like, I can't say that we're any closer to the end of the war because Secretary Austin and Secretary Blinken and Biden didn't meet with Russia. Like, did that really accomplish anything? Probably not. So
They did meet with Russia.
At some point, they shut that off. Am I crazy?
We never cut
I feel
diplomat.
like communications were very down back.
I could be mistaken here, but I'm quite certain that several times during the war, Lloyd Austin has spoken with Shoigu, and Bill Burns had gone to Moscow several times during the war to deliver messages. But also, I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure we never severed diplomatic ties because of the belief that our nations needed to conversate.
Okay. So I could be, if I'm mistaken there, I take it back. But I guess the core of that, I should have just not rambled off the edge. I should have stuck with the core message of talking to Russia isn't a bad thing. If I just stayed there, I would have been in good shape. So I don't think that's the problem. And I think anybody making that argument is kind of missing the forest for the trees. But I do want to shift over to the German elections. This is something I know you're keeping a closer eye on than I am. This was a relatively controversial election, but what I'm seeing this morning is actually, to stick with Russia, they're concerned that Germany is now going to start sending more munitions and allow Ukraine to strike deeper inside of Russian territory. So it sounds like the party that won the most seats is more hawkish in this conflict. Is that an accurate assessment? Okay. What's going on there?
So the German CDU won the majority. In second place behind them was the AfD, which is the new Nazi party that Elon Musk and J.D. Vance, for whatever reason, have some affection towards.
Hold real quick.
Yeah.
Anytime we throw Nazi out there, I feel like we need to explain
Clarify that they actually are. Yeah.
Instead of just a slur. So let's go through that.
So they use Nazi slogans. They're big about, not remembering Germany's past, really heavily leaning into the Nazi heritage of Germany, and really rebelling against a lot of things that Germany has done since the war. And one of the core parts of this is that a German court ruled that they can legally be called a fascist. That sentence kind of breaks my American brain because what are you talking about? But that is a thing in Germany. So that's what's up there. And so Elon Musk poured tons of money into helping them get elected. J.D. Vance, as part of his Munich speech, he also has numerous times supported them. So much so to the extent that the new German leader says that Musk's and Vance's interference in the election was just as severe as Vladimir Putin's interference into the election. Yes. And the AfD is, they want to be friends of Russia. They want to cut off relations with the United States, right? This is these are bad hombres, as the president would say. And so the CDU won, and then in third place was, I believe, Scholz's party, the SPD. There's so many acronyms being thrown around with this thing, but all you need to know is that the center left and the center right are forming a coalition of governing, and the AfD is pretty much going to be locked out. But they still did get nearly 20%. I think it ended up being 18 or 19%, which is still quite a bit. Funny enough, when you look at the map of the results that came in, you can see where East Germany was and where West Germany was. So, little interesting there. But yeah,
East
so
Germany, more AfD voters in East Germany, I would think. Is that what you're hinting at?
My understanding is, for one, what did Margaret Thatcher say? She said historical revisionism or historical. It was something about how in East Germany they had not thoroughly gotten rid of they had not denazified the way the West had, the way the Americans and the French forced Germany to denazify, so therefore they revert historically. And people were pretty upset with her for saying that, but I think, I don't know. And, but yeah, so you can still see how that pans out. Anyway, so Merz is the new chancellor, and he says, well, it's time to move on from the United States. And this guy was a huge Atlanticist, big about the relationship between the United States and Europe, and now he is over it. He says with Trump, the threats coming from the United States is an adversary of Europe, and it also, we need to move to be independent from them. And he's also very aggressive towards Russia, kind of a hawk. And, this is kind of stuff that, under these circumstances, I guess that's what you want. But also, Trump is kind of having this effect across the globe. You're seeing it in Canada right now with the Liberal Party trending upwards. You're seeing it again in the UK, where the Reform Party is now kind of tanking. And before J.D. Vance and Elon interfered in the German election, it seemed like AfD was making quite a surge, but then CDU came and solidified and ended up winning this. So it seems like they are being so aggressive and so bull in a china shop on everything that they are driving their allies in these elections down in the polls.
It was interesting to see, like, the first statement, or what I saw as the first statement of the new. Is he the chancellor then? Is that the term for the guy whose party won, or would there be?
Yes.
Anyways,
I don't know if he's
when he
sworn
came out
in
and said
yet,
we're going
but
to move
yes,
from
he is
the
the chancellor. Yeah.
Anyways, the fact that one of the first things he said was shifting away from the United States, I have a feeling that we overplayed our hand here. We lead the world in so many different ways, and that's accurate. And, when you're looking at economic or military might, that's very, very important. But we're also so intertwined in the international economy, and a lot of that is tied to our military support or military backing or military sales, defense arrangements around the world, that I have this feeling that there's a thought that we're so far ahead that we can just withdraw and we'll be fine, they won't. But it's a little bit like you take this one part out of the system. We've never operated in this new system before at all. So what we know today has been built on this post-World War II liberal economic order, if you will. So to step away from that and say, we're going to be fine, everybody else is going to suffer, I think it's a gamble and far from guaranteed. Like, what if trade relationships suffer around the world? We were just at IDEX. How many countries in Europe or elsewhere are now looking at some of those weapons displays going, well, we're going to have to move away from U.S. weapons going forward. What do the Emiratis have? What do the Turks have? What do the Chinese have? What do the Koreans have? And those Lockheed contracts in Belgium are now going somewhere else. Like, that's an economic hit to the United States. It's a diplomatic hit to the United States. It's a political hit to the United States. And those can pile up. And I just wonder, again, maybe are we too overconfident in our current place in the world?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. I mean, we are throwing the baby out with the bathwater right now. The reason we are so strong, the reason we are the hegemon, is because of the current system that exists. And now, for no real reason other than we're bored and Trump maybe read an autobiography on McKinley, we're just blowing it up. And so that is what's happening. And it will not suit the United States. And they have this idea that Europe is weak, and I disagree. I think Europe is weak because you perceive it as being a sidekick to the United States. But we've seen worlds where the Europe was not a sidekick to the United States. And a world where Europe is an adversary, a world where Europe is not our main ally, and a world where Europe is not purchasing U.S. military equipment. I mean, they're not purchasing U.S. military equipment. U.S. R&D is collapsing. All right, maybe collapse is too dramatic of a word, but the fact that you could develop the F-35 for $2 trillion because you knew you had 32 countries buying it, I mean, that's how that works. If all of a sudden now you just have one country buying it, you're a bit limited in your production there. And the biggest example of that is that the B-52, the stealth, not the B-52, the black, what's our black stealth bomber called? The B-2? The
B-2?
B-2s?
B-2,
Yeah,
there's
the
new
B-2.
B-21 out, yeah.
Yeah, the B-2 and the F-22. There are not a whole lot of those. I believe there are only 20 B-2s and maybe a little over 100 F-22s. There are over 1,000. We have over 1,000 F-35s. So when you don't have a market for exports, good luck, you know.
There's a piece of this where we've been, for quite a while, we've been bad allies in certain degrees, right? People would say that the South Vietnamese trusted us and we let them down. And then the Kurds trusted us. And I'm sure I'm missing some here. The Iraqis trusted us after 2003. The Afghans trusted us. And now what will happen if we move on from not just Ukraine, but all of Europe? And we've been in such a position to where it hasn't really mattered. Like, people do still trust us, or maybe need us, in a sense, is a better way to say it. But I do wonder how this plays with Europe. If we're talking, or with Asia, if we genuinely are going to be making this big pivot to Asia Pacific, and they see not just the stepping away from Ukraine, which has long been an argument, right? If we abandon Ukraine, then China is going to look at Taiwan and say we can do this because the U.S. won't stand with Taiwan. That's been one of the arguments there. But how do our other allies there, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and then of course Taiwan, how do they look at this if we're pivoting so hard away from Europe entirely? I wonder what impact that might have long term.
I think the result of the war in Ukraine determines U.S. credibility, right? As you're saying here. And if the U.S. just walks away for really no reason other than the president likes to make deals when it comes to Ukraine, it's just, you know, how can anyone believe our word in Taiwan, right? So, yeah, I agree with you. I think we're being a bad ally, and I think it's I don't think we'll have any credibility going forward if we destroy NATO and we sacrifice Ukraine to Russia. It hasn't been disclosed. No one has a good theory as to why Trump has this love for Putin. Of course, like we talked about, people say he's bought or whatever. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know why he likes him, but something's up there, and we don't really know why.
I struggle with this because I know the United States in general. I think folks would probably say the Democratic Party, but I'll just leave it at the United States overplayed. Because not even the United States. I think some of this was in Europe as well, but overplayed the Russian misinformation and Russian connections in 2016. As in, there was something happening, but it wasn't all it was hyped up to be. To the degree of like Trump is a Russian agent in disguise kind of stuff, right? And all of this evidence is going to come out tomorrow, and then here we are, and it hasn't happened. The hand was so overplayed there that I think people have kind of numbed to it, to where I've had conversations with people where they've kind of laughed at the idea of Russian disinformation. They're like, yeah, just like in 2016. It's like, no, like in 2025. Like it's happening right now. So I struggle with that because I think a lot of people, we got so far ahead of ourselves in that regard that I'm scared to go back into that camp. But I've seen people recently make the comment, if you view Trump's actions as designed to help Russia, it makes more sense. And where I struggle is that looks to be accurate right now. Like if you view it through that lens, it's like, yes, Putin would like this, Putin would like that, Putin would like this, Putin would like that. Not to the extreme, right? The extreme would be declaring some sort of war on Europe as a whole and unilaterally withdrawing from NATO yesterday and forcing Congress to try to find a way for that not to happen, and sending arms shipments to Russia, right? Like, there's clearly a more overt pro-Russian stance to be taken there, but it does seem like one action after the next, one statement after the next is, I mean, the media in Russia is loving this. They're celebrating this day in and day out, going, my God, it's better than we thought. It's very hard to understand, because I do think you can be, I have a lot of friends that are very much in the America First camp, of which I actually, for what it's worth, used to consider myself. Kind of, I think it's veered a bit, but I've always kind of viewed foreign policy through the lens of what's best for the United States. Maybe that's more of a realist type approach, but that we don't go fighting foreign wars to, quote, uphold democracy around the world. It's to expand our influence abroad. But I do have a lot of friends kind of in the America First camp, and I understand that, but I don't think we don't need to sever ties in the way that we are. We don't need to cozy up to Putin to be America First. It feels like there's been some overstepping there, and I'm having a hard time kind of figuring out why.
Yeah, it feels like we're surrendering, right? It feels like that Ronald Reagan speech, A Time for Choosing. I think that everyone knows about the one where he says, you know, when you appease, your only choices are between fight and surrender, right? It just feels like we're surrendering, right? And I have no idea why. No one has given an answer to us. I mean, the J.D. Vance is the only one who communicates with the public, and he's very disingenuous about most of it. So I don't know. And J.D. Vance is someone I found to be likable, but the more he tweets, the more I don't like him. So, you know, what will we do with that?
Let's move with that into what I think should be our last topic today, talking about some of the firings at the Pentagon. We're going to try to keep this show relatively short because we're going to come back Friday and inevitably have 17 more things that we need to hit on. But pretty big steps at the Pentagon the last couple of days. And the reason I'm tying this into your tweeting portion is from J.D. Vance, is because that appears to be how the Pentagon is communicating right now, is via tweet. I did not know until yesterday there were actual Pentagon press secretaries, because they're not doing interviews, they're not doing press conferences, they're not going on news shows, they're tweeting at reporters and kind of like owning reporters online. And it's not, if I'm being honest, it's not very helpful.
No.
And it's not very helpful in a case like what happened Friday afternoon. So we generally look at anything that comes out Friday afternoon as the government is trying to bury it a little bit. Now, they're never going to, in the modern era, you're never going to bury a story entirely. It's still going to get reported on, of course. But if you have your choice, you put out the big news during the week, earlier in the week. I think Wednesday is referred to as like the best day to put out a very positive story. Friday afternoon, you've got reporters that are already home for the weekend. You've got news outlets that have like limited staff. It's just not going to get the same attention as it would otherwise. Friday afternoon, a memo came out that General Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has been removed, along with quite a few other firings down the chain of command at pretty high levels. And I think we're actually going to come back to this on Friday, Ben, because we should have more information by that point. But a couple key things to keep in mind here. The president does have the authority to do this. Full stop. Like there's this, a lot of what we're seeing right now is outside of the norms, but not outside of the law. And I think we should remember that at times. So people getting upset about the norms, like, okay, what was the thing you said about the dogs in basketball? That's a great line here.
Someone tweeted once that, you know, for the past 8 years, Democrats have been saying, hey, a dog can't play basketball, while Air Bud keeps dunking on them over and over and over again. And that's a summary of how Trump engages in Washington,
So I'm seeing a lot of people freak out right now about the norms being broken, and the possible successor is a 3-star general who's in retirement. So they kind of breaking norms. They'd have to pull him out of retirement. They chose him above a bunch of other 4-stars that are by law qualified. In the military, you generally have to hold a certain position before you can hold the next one, kind of like criteria moving up. And in this case, they would have to sign a waiver because he hasn't held those positions. So it's a lot of outside the norms, not illegal. Or I guess technically, how does that work? Technically, would it be illegal given outside of a waiver? That's not important. It can be
No,
done.
if you have
It's
to
just
sign
outside
a
the
waiver,
norms.
that makes it legal. Yeah.
So
It's
then
just
it is
weird.
legal. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's legal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting move. You've got a lot on the right now. The general response on the left is that this is a purge of people that are not loyal to the president. Part of the pushback, part of the argument there is that the reason for General Brown's firing was not disclosed. They just put out a general statement of like, we thank him for his service that you would expect when somebody retires from that position, and was praising of him. And this comes back to there hasn't been a Pentagon press conference, so we can't actually ask those questions of anyone. But the next step here will be the arguments for this that I'm seeing on the right side are that, hey, the president gets to pick his people, and that's what he's doing. Why wait? Why give it a few months? Why give it a few years? If he wants his people in there that he thinks are better for the job at hand, he should put them in their place. That seems to be the general back and forth right now. Both of those, I think it's one of those where both of those are right. But the big move, in my opinion, will be in the next couple weeks here. There is supposedly supposed to be I don't think you can say that, can you? Supposedly supposed to?
I don't know. I feel like we've been saying words that aren't words this whole podcast. But go on.
Nonsense words. That's what my daughter calls
Yeah.
them, nonsense words.
Yes. Shout out. Yeah.
Anyways, there's supposed to be a panel meeting to determine a bunch of 3- and 4-star generals if they should be removed from service. That one's going to be very interesting because in the military, you're apolitical. You cannot take overtly political stances. So what is the criteria going to be looking at these folks that to get to that position, they had to have done well? Now, they could have made mistakes along the way, or maybe they're not performing at their current job. Fine. But it'll be interesting to see what the criteria ends up being for the removal of additional senior officers if that comes to fruition. And if it does, it's probably going to be in the next couple weeks here.
What do you think about the firing of the JAGs?
That's one I'm still gathering more information on. So these are the judge advocate generals, the top legal folks in the United States. Essentially what they do is they tell you, like, you can or cannot do that thing because it would be in violation of the law of war. It's a very good position to have. That's our top cover in the military. Prevents us from accidentally targeting things or going on missions or carrying out actions that could be very, very, very bad for people all the way down the chain of command. My understanding is that they have released those, but they've not named any successors, which is kind of a unique move. My concern, anytime you remove the legal folks from the system right away, that does raise a few red flags. Secretary Hegseth said something yesterday where it was they don't want people that are just going to be roadblocks. But, you know, that is a little bit their job. Mm-hmm. We can argue whether that's good or not, but they are trying to protect American service members from taking illegal actions. So the Hegseth comment makes me nervous. I think that's going to be something to keep an eye on. Who comes into those positions, or do they remain unfilled for a period of time?
Well, the reaction of this has been more interesting because you've been seeing a lot of veterans, a lot of fighter pilots. I only say fighter pilots because those are the ones I remember seeing the reactions of. But a lot of people saying, you know, you only fire the JAGs if you're planning on doing something illegal, right? What that illegal action is, I don't know. But you know, you saw the Attorney General of Arizona saying there's a coup of the Constitution in progress here, and more overt calls for Trump being a dictator. Yeah, interesting. It seems like there's a lot of people not having it right now. At least with an
for the military
explanation
moves
pending
here.
one. Yeah.
For the military moves here, by and large, what I'm seeing are approval, disapproval along partisan lines, for what it's worth. So I am seeing people in support of all of these, and they tend to be people that support just about everything Trump is doing. I'm not seeing a lot of crossover at this point, so I think that's something worth keeping in mind.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, that's where it stands here. Firing the JAGs is concerning, especially since there is no explanation. I will say Trump has the power to fire General C.Q. Brown, and of course he did use that power. What concerns me is his appointment of Kane here, or as he called him, Raisin Kane, which is it's like a little funny. A little, okay, let me ask you this. We know Trump loves fast food, right? I'll get to my point about Kane here in a second. Do you think he's definitely had Raisin Kane before, but do you think it's his first choice over Popeyes, or do you think he's KFC through and through?
I don't know that he's a chicken guy at baseline. Probably start there.
Yeah.
I think that is a flawed assumption that he has had Raisin Canes.
Well, how else do you call him Raisin Kane then?
This is call sign. I think it's the guy's call sign.
Oh.
I don't think that was a Trump nickname.
Oh, okay. You might be right then.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm actually going to agree with you then. I don't think Trump's had Raisin Canes then. I don't think he's had
that would
Dave's
be
Hot
outside
Chicken.
of it.
And I also don't think he's had Popeyes either.
Popeye's pretty good.
But
we're veering.
Anyway,
you don't like Raisin Canes? You don't like General Kane?
No. Okay, yeah. General Kane. No, I don't have any issues with them as of right now. My only point of concern is that when he met Trump in Iraq in 2018, he told him, "I love you, sir. I'll kill for you, sir." Right? Which, I mean, in the context of the ISIS mission, targeting ISIS, right? But then he also took the service members and put them in MAGA hats, which, as you say, is a violation of, I believe, federal law, right? Active duty military aren't allowed to wear political signs. Maybe not law. Maybe it's like the customs. I don't know. Anyways, this has been cited by people on the left as being a sign that he's hired someone to do something illegal for him. I don't know. Where do you stand on that?
Community note on that one. So that story originated with Trump.
Yes.
Kane has not ever mentioned it as happening. And people close to Kane say that is wildly out of character for anything he would have done.
Okay.
So, unfortunately, we do have someone in office that just says things sometimes.
That's
my
crazy.
hope in this case is that he. So it's not like there was somebody as of right now. There's not somebody who was there that can authenticate that, except for Trump, who says it happened, and Kane, who hasn't spoken on it. So,
and those around Kane say that's that's crazy. Can you
to be fair, if that did happen, if that did happen, big fucking problem. No question about it. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle, what political stance, what ideology, any of that stuff. That's a problem. If an active duty officer is like donning that stuff in a combat zone, nonetheless. I'm kind of getting the vibe right now that might be a Trump story, which is crazy because it actually makes it harder for people to get behind his candidate. But either way, that's where we are.
Yeah, that's where we are here. But what do you think about this? James Carville. Do you know who James Carville is?
I'm familiar.
The Raging Cajun. And he worked for President Clinton. He spends most of his time on CNN yelling at Democrats, saying they're doing everything wrong. He's a lifelong Democrat, though. So he does every Democrat's most favorite activity, which is saying the Democratic Party is doing everything wrong. And anyways, he says that Trump's administration will totally collapse within the next 30 days and that an impeachment and removal, we're due for one. Do you have any thoughts on this? His reasoning here is, these new polls coming out showing his approval rating going down week after week. Of course, Trump says his approval rating's 80%. So that's, those are fun numbers. And but they're going down, and this poll that YouGov did showed that 49% of Americans believe Donald Trump to be a dictator, 71% believe Vladimir Putin to be a dictator, and I believe it's 17% believe Zelensky is one. I don't think Trump is a dictator yet. I think he is certainly... He's doing some things that have made me very cautious, but I would not call him a dictator yet. But do you have any thoughts on this James Carville claim that within 30 days, it's over for Donald?
Well, I don't know what that would look like.
Yeah.
what a collapse of administration would look like. So this can be hard to measure. I do think we're probably going to see some people rotate out of the administration pretty quickly here. Rubio looks awful, man. Had high hopes for the guy, but he does not look happy to be there.
No.
I don't know that means he's going to leave. This is a big position, probably something he's worked for his whole life. But a lot of these folks are kind of getting thrashed a little bit, and I wonder how much of it they're wanting to take. On that note, the State Department, Rubio, put out a tweet the other day saying, the first month in office, great accomplishments by the State Department. And it had an image of a passport that said month 1 accomplishments. So I clicked on it, and it was just an image of the passport. So then I scrolled down looking for the link of accomplishments, and there's no link. So well, maybe I'm just an idiot. So I went to the State Department website, scrolled through that whole fucking thing. There is no list of accomplishments that he. So I don't know. Just I'm going to start doing that. Here's my accomplishments for the month of February, and then just leave it blank.
Nothing. Yeah.
So it's. Anyways, I think we're probably. I'd like to see those. I wasn't trying to troll them or anything. I wanted to what are they so we could talk about them, right?
Yeah.
What are the things the State Department views as the top things they've done this month would have been a good conversation point. We don't know what those are. Anyways, I think we probably will see some people move. This has to be, and it was the same with Trump in 2016. It has to be exhausting to a degree. To go back to Hegseth, right? Trump has undercut him a few times in saying things that completely contradict what Hegseth says. I don't know how much of that you can take or you want to take. And there, if poll numbers are slipping, there's probably going to be some scapegoating going on too.
How long does Marco Rubio last in the job? So Rex Tillerson, who called the president a fucking moron and then resigned, I believe he did the interview calling him a quote, a fucking moron and then resigning. I think he did it and then resigned. But he lasted until March. So he was sworn in February 1st, 2017. And then he resigned March 31st of 2018. Does Rubio make it to the end of the year?
Does he pass the Tillerson test? To the end of the year?
To the end of the year.
Oh, I don't think he makes it to the end of the year. I think he's already been put in some very difficult positions. He's getting a lot of heat for changing positions on things already, and I don't know. I see the wild card here is something that is very hard to measure, and I'm not familiar with. Is this level of not loyalty even, but it's with all politicians at that level where it's this level of importance or self-worth or something. It's the argument for why Biden decided to not only run in the first place, but stay and think that he should continue service to the nation at his age. That argument of you need to do it. It's no, man, no. That's hard to measure, and I feel that's a big part of this. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I would say probably not to the end of the year, though. He just looks defeated every time he's on camera.
The question is, will he resign? I don't know. Or will he? I can't imagine he's fired. They all have minders. People forget this, but they all have minders with them. People to keep them in line with the, quote, president's agenda. So maybe he will quit. I don't know. Let me ask you this.
We'll check back in 30 days.
Yeah, does Mike Waltz make it to the end of the year?
I'll say yes. I'll say yes. I can't figure out Waltz quite yet. I thought I had a good idea of kind of his positions on things, but they seem to be changing. But he does seem, just a rough assessment, he seems more confident in the role right now than Rubio does in his, I would say.
That's fair. I also think we don't see Mike Waltz as much.
I think he can stay out of the camera a bit more.
Yeah, it's Mike, right? Yeah. So that's going to conclude our episode here, unless you have anything else you'd like to add, Preston.
Nope. Good Monday wrap, man. We'll be back in a few days with even more.
Yeah, check out Preston's YouTube channel. He did a lot of stuff for Edge, who so graciously brought us out to Abu Dhabi to film this arms convention, and we saw all kinds of things. I saw a general's hat, a floating general's hat that looked like that was a firehouse. It didn't look like one. So that was interesting. And I'm going to be posting a video soon on my own channel here about my time at NATO. But that will conclude our episode. So like, comment, subscribe, give us 5 stars. Tell us what you think we're right or wrong. And we will see you on Friday, probably with a new slate of insane information. But we'll see you next time.
We'll see y'all then.